Hi there, and welcome to September's edition of First Friday. My name's Tom, he's Stuart, and so far we've looked at a number of different topics over these months together. Today we're going to talk about marriage, and this is a big one, and obviously what it is, why it's so important. Before we look into it, let me just say that in a couple of months' time, so I think for October's edition of First Friday, the plan is for us to do a Q&A month where we answer any questions that you have. We already have a few questions that have been sent in, so for those of you who have done that, many thanks. We will get to those questions. We thought we'd just do all of them in one go. So if you've got a question that you'd like us to answer, please send an email to info@gnba.net, info@gnba.net, or just leave a comment on YouTube if that's where you're watching. And we're keeping an eye on all of those questions there as well. So, marriage. I thought it'd be quite nice, Stuart, to start with your marriage. You are married. How long have you been married for? And tell us a little bit about how you met.
That's right. Start with mine. This year, 2021, we've been married 30 years.
30 years.
30
that
years.
Is impressive.
Yes. And we met in Sheffield. I was doing a student pastoral placement for 3 months in Sheffield, and that's when we met, and we started dating, and after 8 days I asked Helen to marry me.
Are you serious?
And, yes, we started dating at the beginning of August.
8 days?
8 days.
Wow.
We got married in the following June in 1991, because you know when you know, and it's 30 years gone just like that. And Helen is my best friend. I can't really read what she's written for me to write here. She is my best friend. She is my most trusted confidant, and she is the finest Christ one I know, and that is not me being biased. That's because I live with her, and more crucially, she has had to live with me. And all, I know we joke, but I am not easy to live with anyway. But when you're in ministry, and that's a whole topic on its own, isn't it? Marriage and ministry. With the pressures that come for that, but I remember in a moment of tender romance, I said to Helen, "This is true." I said to Helen, Helen, I love being married to you," and she went, "Yes, Stuart, I would love being married to me too." So.
Wow, there you go. There's some stuff I learnt there. I didn't know. There's me thinking that I knew you quite well. 8 days.
Yes.
That is impressive. So for me, I'm married to Eleanor. We've been married for 18 years, which seems very impressive until you hear that you've been married for 30 years. So I think you're going to continue to beat me on that. So she's a midwife, and she genuinely is the coolest, most amazing person I've ever met. And it is, as you say, I know that I will be seen to be biased, but it really is a privilege to share my life with someone that I just love so dearly. And just how we met was at Salvation Army Church in Openshaw, and she joined an Eden team. Eden teams were these youth and community kind of voluntary positions where you join a church and do youth and community work in the area. Now, no church would accept us, so we started our own church as well. And Eleanor came up from London, and there was one of the other guys, a guy called Matt, had said, I'm going to marry that girl. And so when she first came in, he'd already kind of given me a bit of a warning that she was off. She was not available because she was going to marry him. And so she walked into the room, and I was like, wow, she is beautiful. So fair play. All right. So I kind of just, out of respect, I'm not really sure why, I kind of just thought this guy was going to end up with her. So just went on my merry way. And over the months, we just found that when we'd go and hang out at people's homes after we'd done community work, youth work, that we'd often end up just the two of us chatting well into the night. And so when it was getting to the point where we're like, all right, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, we're still chatting away and everyone else has long gone to bed, I wondered if there was something going on. And I spoke to my mum, and she said, oh, don't bother, she's way out of your league. That's literally what my mum said. Good old mum. And so I just thought, right, I haven't got a chance. Anyway, it got to the point, and the story is that we'd been chatting for months and months, and I was just, I was head over heels for her. And she thought, because I hadn't made a move, that maybe I wasn't interested. And she'd written in her diary, Lord, a little bit of a fleece, really, put out and said, if he doesn't say anything in the next 4 days, I'm just going to have to drop it and we'll just be friends. And so it just so happens that it was on the 4th day, that last day, that I had plucked up the courage to ask her if she wanted to go and do some extra youth work on the park. That's a
great chat up line.
I just said, should we go and do some youth work together? And I was praying that there would be no young people anywhere. And it just so happens that there were none around. And we went to Delamere Park, and I walked over to, there's a little shelter there in the middle of the park, and sat down. I was so nervous. Told her that I liked her, and she said the same. And here's the funny part of the story. We walked up to the main road, and I said, it's so embarrassing now. I said I'd hold her hand across the road, as if she's 4 years older than me. She was in her 20s, as if she needed help, like an old lady kind of crossing the road. Anyway, so we held hands, got across the road, and obviously this had freaked Eleanor out to think, he maybe thinks that, that this is going to go faster than it should. And so we got to her house. She said, I've got a book for you. So she went inside and came back with I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris, which was obviously Joshua Harris has fallen away from the Lord, sadly, in recent times. But there was a point when everyone was reading that book, and the idea was that you don't kiss, you don't do anything physical before you get married. Now, we did have a kiss, but it really set the tone, I think, for making sure that we were appropriate through our courting days. But I didn't propose after 8 days, let's say that. I think it was about a year and a half. Then I proposed, and then 9 months from there. But it's a wonderful privilege to get to share my life. I was thinking about this, how so many things in life change, don't they? So friendships come and go, even churches. I've been to different churches. Jobs come and go, but actually my marriage to Eleanor remains the same and always should. And so there is this discussion amongst people whether marriage is a contract. Is it simply just a piece of paper, like a lot of people think? Is it a sacrament, like a lot of the Catholics believe, or is it a covenant? And I would say that I believe it is a covenant. When you look at the vows that have been made, the words that I've said to her and she said to me, I think there is a covenant there, and I think we have to take very seriously the covenants we make. I don't know if you agree that it's a covenant.
Absolutely. I think on the horizontal level on earth, in terms of our relationships, it's the most important.
Yeah, I agree.
The best, when it comes to parenting, I know we're going on to talk about that another time, but the best piece of advice I would give to parents, if you want to be the best parent you can to your children, be the best spouse you can. That's where it begins. And you talked about being surprised after 8 days. I was 24. I had been on the dating merry-go-round. And again, there's another discussion just how appropriate that is for Christians. But that was me. But I got to the stage where I gave that part of my life over to God. Now, let me qualify that, because this is important. This is a guide. It's not. I'm not saying it's a guarantee. It's it's something that worked out for me. I wasn't saying, and I don't say to young people in particular, because young people are not the only ones who can marry. I am not saying that because you give that part of your life over to God, that means that you can't date, or that the person you should date should be the one you're going to marry. Part of the dating process is discovering just how compatible you are.
Yeah.
But I had been on the dating road.
On the market.
Yeah, right. Well, and I eventually got to that stage in my life. I was 24, but I was training for the ministry, Tom, and so there's an appropriateness there. Not a minister has to be married, but I don't think a minister should be a prolific dater in that sense. And so I gave that part of my life really over to God, and not without a bit of trepidation, because you do. I'm saying, God, I give this over to you if I'm to be married, and there God would turn around and say, well, Stuart, here's somebody I've been trying to offload for quite some time, and now I've got a volunteer. But it wasn't like that. And so very soon, when we were dating, you just know because you know, and that's why I asked Helen to marry me, and she said yes. And I don't think if it becomes in a dating relationship, no matter what age you are, if it becomes apparent very, very quickly that this is never going to be marriage, I would suggest that you shouldn't be a couple any longer, But how long does that take? And, I had some longer term relationships before I met Helen, but that's a story we'll never go into. But you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, because Eleanor was the same as that. She's 4 years older than me, and she had been actually engaged previously. And so, although I didn't propose after 8 days, she had done a similar thing to you and kind of said, Lord, I'm giving this over to you, and I don't want to date anymore. My plan is not to date someone for a while. Ultimately, the plan is to head towards marriage. And I think that ultimately should be the aim of every relationship. Now, obviously, that's not to say that the first person you date, you marry, but it should be that your intention is to move towards marriage with whoever you're dating. And if it is clear that it's not right, then you step out as soon as you can. So we're having this discussion a little bit with my daughters at the moment, the question of when they can date. And in my mind, it is you've got to be at a point where to be going out with someone, the aim is that ultimately that would end in marriage. So if you're not thinking about marriage, as you wouldn't be at 16 or whatever, then there is no reason to, do you know what I mean? There's no real reason to date, is there? If you're dating simply for dating's sake, all that's going to do is isolate you from other friendships that you could have, but also leave you open to the temptation of taking that further than it should go. And how many people do we know who have come together and basically had sex with someone while they're dating and been joined together in a way, and they feel like there's a closeness there, there's an intimacy there because you've shared something that is meant to be within the confines of marriage, and then it's fallen apart, and actually there wasn't that much in common, but the physical side of things, I think, can make you feel like you are closer than you are. So yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that dating is a dangerous game, and I think again, Joshua Harris, who obviously I mentioned earlier, had kind of talked about that in the book, that there was a whole culture in America, and I think in the UK as well, of dating, going on various dates and dating lots of different people at different points, and saying that's ultimately not what we're called to do. And I don't think we really see that in the Bible either. We see, obviously, in Genesis 2, verse 24, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So I think there is a progression there of, before there is the union of one flesh, you leave your mother and father, you leave your home, you join together, and you're to hold fast and become one flesh. Obviously, there's lots of implications of that, but I think in terms of dating, we need to put things in the right order. But when you know, and obviously you knew fairly early.
And in all seriousness, I wish I had known that about dating when I was dating. You know, the book Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, which I have to say, as respectfully as I can, is a book about sexual love primarily. It is an erotic book, Tom. You know, it's a sexual book, and yes, it has a spiritual application, but I think we play far too safe when we just jump to the spiritual application of it.
I agree.
It's a beautiful book within the context of marriage, but there's a recurring refrain throughout that book: do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. And that really deserves a lot of reflecting on, and it is a safeguard, and I wish I had known that. I'm glad that I can testify that the first girl I slept with was my wife on our wedding night, but I wish I had known that about dating.
Yeah,
before.
Absolutely. I think that verse is so important in Song of Solomon. And I was thinking that there are many dangers in marriage, but I think two of them are these two extremes that you can have, which is on the one side, we make too much of marriage and we put too much into it, as in somehow your spouse can be your saviour. That ultimately you're going to be disappointed, aren't you? If my wife got married to me and thought that I was going to solve all of the issues, that there's never going to be any difficulties, well, that's absolutely not true. When you take one sinner and you add another sinner and you put them together, you don't get perfect marital bliss. You get difficulty, you get hardship, but working through that, you can have a beautiful relationship together. But sometimes we put too much on it, and we miss the fact that there are many people who are called to singleness, and there are people who are called to times of singleness, whether it is when a spouse dies or for whatever reason. And so if marriage is the be-all and end-all, then I think we're going to put too much weight on it. And I think, honestly, churches sometimes have made too much of this, that marriage is basically the goal of life. Get married and you're going to be happy, you're going to be healthy, everything's going to be sorted. I think we put too much emphasis sometimes on marriage and forget the fact that the best way to serve and the easiest way, the freest way to be able to serve the Lord with your entire life is to be single. And I think singleness should be recognised as a genuine calling of the Lord and not a curse, actually is a gift. So we need marriage to be put in its right place. On the other side, sometimes we don't give marriage enough time and enough emphasis. And I think of someone like John Wesley, who both you and I have got a lot of affection for, and an incredible evangelist, an amazing intellect, great Bible knowledge. But it seems to me that he kind of neglected his marriage, really, to the detriment of his wife. I'm sure the story is that he was on the road so much that he didn't realise his wife had died until 4 days afterwards. And I don't think he was particularly grieved by it. They had a difficult marriage because he wasn't there. And again, you can have this like obsession with marriage, and somehow my spouse is going to be my saviour. That is idolatry, and it is sinful, and it is going to ultimately leave you wanting and empty. On the other side, I think some people just presume that marriage will just work itself out on its own, and you don't have to input into it, and you don't have to give time and energy to it. And I just, marriage is an amazing gift, and it is a beautiful thing, but it's hard work. And if you don't put time into that relationship, if you don't think over it and pray over your marriage and recognise that, the devil loves to destroy families, doesn't he? The devil loves to destroy marriages. And so we've got to be aware of that. I was thinking about that when I came out of the house this morning. Next door to us, they have bought a lockdown dog. So through lockdown, as many people have, they've bought this dog. And when they bought it as a puppy, it was tiny little dog. I don't know what breed it was. Anyway, over the months, it is exploded in size. It is huge. And so I came out this morning, and we've got a big fence between us and next door. But I stepped out into the garden, and all I heard was this, and I just almost jumped out of my skin. And every time you go out the back door, he's in the garden, this dog, and just, and I thought that verse in Genesis 4, verse 7, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Sin is at work. The world, the flesh, and the devil would desire to destroy our marriages. And we have got to be very careful that often I see in dating, guys are really good at pursuing their girlfriend or even their fiance, but you get them married and suddenly it was like we've got to the end of the race. We're married now, and you can pull back and you don't try and date your wife anymore. You don't try and woo her. I think that's really dangerous. Both of those extremes are dangerous, and we need to be somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. And, it was not me that said it, but it is very true. Marriage is not just about marrying the right person. Marriage is about being the right person. Yeah. If we're going into marriage because we see it as an answer to something, or even an escape from something. Let me just go back to something that you said, about the calling to singleness, and I think this is something that you and I will feel more because we have daughters. Your daughters are a lot younger.
Yeah.
My daughters are in their 20s and still single. And that can bring its own pressure. I do think that we, not just in the church, but generally still in society, and particularly when it comes to daughters, they are raised with the expectation of the white wedding, and almost like the Prince and Charming and Cinderella wedding, and in church and all the rest of it, and the expectation is there. It is the norm.
Yeah,
marriage is the norm. In terms of not being single is the norm. That'd be better to put it that way. But there's a whole lot of pressures than that, and then when as females in particular grow older and they're still single, they can see themselves as being abnormal, and that particularly it is keenly felt in the church. So, for example, at say a church social, and particularly a single female, and she ends up at the children's table. I have witnessed that, but I've also had it relayed to me from people in that position, do you know what I mean? And they're always seen as kind of childminder or the babysitter. They end up at in the general life of the church, and say a single guy starts attending the church, and you get these matchmaking is not a ministry.
It's not a spiritual gift.
And obviously, the background to what you said there about being able to serve God more effectively. The background to that is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where it talks about marriage and singleness. I would encourage, particularly any single female Christian watching this or listening to this of any age, to start, and I don't think you can be too young, maybe 14, 15, 16, to start reading anything by Elizabeth Elliot. She really, she's in heaven now, but she writes so well on this issue. Anything that our daughters can read from the likes of Elizabeth Elliot will really help them in this department of their lives, in the sense of whether it be to marriage or whether it be to singleness, surrendering that part of your life too. But also from 1 Corinthians 7, here's the starter. We talk about not just marrying the right person, but being the right person. And I think that for the Christian, Scripture sets down an unquestionable, it cannot be argued baseline. At the end of 1 Corinthians 7, he must belong to the Lord. It is not the will of God, because it's not scriptural, that Christians marry non-Christians. And as a pastor, I have never married a Christian to a non-Christian, not knowingly, and I have refused to do weddings where a Christian marries a non-Christian, because I don't believe that the Scriptures allow me to. And I've had more issues from young people, single young people, because I'll even say, don't even date a non-Christian. All the things we're talking about is that Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart. It's the wellspring of life. Although you had feelings for Eleanor, you didn't put it in your diary before that first time you saw her, when you thought she was beautiful and all the rest of it. You didn't put it in your diary today, I'm going to fall in love today. That's not the way love works. You don't put it in your diary. You might set out looking for somebody, but you never know who's going to capture your heart. And that's why you have to guard your heart. And that's why Proverbs says, in regard from the perspective of the husband, that a godly wife is a gift from God. And we have to give that part of our lives over. But I've had young people, single young people over the years, really fall out with me when I've said, don't even go there. Don't even date an unsafe person. When I have had the privilege of being involved pastorally with a couple looking to get married. I don't have premarital counselling for me is very important, but I don't have 5 or 6 weeks because they really don't need me. If they need me that much, they really shouldn't be talking about getting married. I have one session with them, and we talk through these 8 questions. Can I read them to you?
Yeah.
And the first question was from my experience when Helen and I went for premarital counselling. This was the first question the pastor asked us, and it's such a disarming question. Number 1, how do you know you're in love with each other? Isn't that such a great... It's an obvious question, but yet it's helpful to... Well, how do we know that we're in love with each other beyond just being in lust with each other?
Yeah.
So how do you know you're in love with each other? Are you both comfortable with the pace and depth of your relationship in terms of this being the right time to commit to each other in marriage? Is there anything significant about you that your prospective spouse does not know but should know? You know, like I said earlier, an example, are you running away from something or someone and getting married? Are you both agreed about finances, from saving to spending? You know, among the top 3 pressures of marital breakups are financial pressures.
Absolutely.
Are you both agreed about children, from whether you want children to how children should be brought up? Are you both agreed about God? How do your families feel about you getting married? That's important. It should not be a determinative factor, but it's an important factor to consider. And then my final question is, whose family will you spend Christmas with? That is such a big pressure, isn't it? And can I say, if anybody wants these questions, Tom, if they want to get in touch with yourself through Good News or the First Friday website, and I'd be glad to send these questions to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're really good. It's interesting that I'm sure my mother-in-law wouldn't mind me saying this, that when she was on her wedding day, was the first time that she met the family of her brand new husband, and she realised that day that she'd made a terrible mistake, and she didn't realise until she met this family member that basically her husband's mum told her a whole load of stuff on that day, can you believe? And they went on to be married for a number of years, but unfortunately it did lead to divorce because of various situations. But someone's family is quite a key thing, and it might seem obvious that the people would meet other family members but that would be a basic thing for me. Make sure you know other people who know this person, because sometimes things can be hidden, and actually someone's mum or whatever, or a brother or a sister, can help you kind of understand who they are. I just wanted to echo what you said about not marrying someone who isn't a Christian, and I think this makes sense of a lot of things in the Old Testament when God God would allow it. It was never God's plan for multiple marriages. I don't think you can find anywhere that says I endorse this, but God did allow it for a season because of people's hard heart, I think. But there is a very specific warning, though. The Lord says, do not marry from other nations. And sometimes people can look at that and go, oh, it's a kind of a racist thing. Not at all. It was about, like with Solomon, the multiple wives of different faiths basically pulling him away from faith in God. And I think, I can't remember if we've used the example before, that if you are stood on a chair and someone else stood off the chair, you know the example of it's much easier
Spurgeon came out with that. Yeah,
it's much easier to pull the person off. And basically, if you are choosing to enter into a dating relationship, we've already said that dating should inevitably be looking to marriage at some point, however long that is. That should be the plan. That if you get together then with someone who isn't a Christian, and you're heading towards that way, galloping towards it, then it's very hard to put the brakes on that, and your emotions and all those feelings. But you are going to enter into a lifelong commitment with someone who has a fundamentally different worldview than you. Has and the jealousy that can come from that, from when, let's say the wife who is a Christian and the husband who isn't, the wife's first and foremost priority is to Jesus. And so he is the most important person in her life. That's quite hard for someone who isn't a Christian to understand. But that's why it says so clearly in the Old Testament. But then, in the New Testament, in the reason I had my phone, I've realised that I've left my Bible on the other side of the room, and I didn't want to stop the recording. And if you remember, a couple of programs back, I had said very specifically, you'd never see a program when we don't have our Bibles open. You do.
There we go.
Stuart wins on this one. I put it down to the fact that he made me a cup of tea before, and I should have had coffee. But I have got my Bible on my phone, and I was thinking of that passage in 1 Peter chapter 3 that specifically addresses those who've become Christians after getting married. That's a different situation. I think, again, people merge all these verses together and say, well, look, maybe I'll win my husband over if I get married to him. Yeah, but the Bible says, do not enter into that. But if you are married, and I know a number of women who have become Christians after getting married, then the Bible says, as long as your husband will stay with you, or your wife will stay with you, you stay with them, and they will see something of your life. Like you talked with your wife, you have seen her life day in and day out. What an amazing example that is to you. But you are not to choose that and enter into an unyoked relationship, which is going to make it difficult. And those women who've become Christians, I know, after getting married, it's an additionally hard life, basically, of living in that situation where your husband has a completely different worldview than you. So don't choose it, but if you're in it, I would encourage, don't leave that and work at it and pray that God would use your example to lead them to Christ.
Yes, and of course there is a difference, but for a Christian to go into a marriage with an unsaved person, 100%, yeah. You don't even need to pray about that. I don't believe that we need to pray about everything. I don't. Do I need to pray that do I need to ask God if I should cheat on my wife? No. No. Do I need to ask God if a Christian should marry an unsaved person? No, because the Bible already says so don't pray about it. There's no need to pray about it. And the grace of God working out in say the unsaved spouse getting saved, that's a testimony to the grace of God. It's not a testimony that it was right. Mm. And we need to keep that in mind. But as 25 years as a pastor, as I have witnessed this again and again and again, and by the way, I can't point to one person who took my pastoral advice.
Really?
Because like a lot of other doctrinal things, they can find another pastor 5 minutes down the road who will marry them. We need to get back to a bit of solidarity, scriptural solidarity within the ministry. But again, there's so many topics that we could talk about that go out from this. But here's the point. Again and again and again. So I didn't marry them, they just got somebody else to marry them. And every single one has seen a deterioration in that it is my experience as a pastor of witnessing this again and again and again, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, from your experience, that when it comes to accommodation, to compromise and concession, it's always the Christian spouse who gives away more.
Yeah, that's definitely my experience.
And how can Christ be at the centre of a relationship? How can a minister in the marriage ceremony pray the blessing of God on an unequally yoked couple? It just can't happen because God has only been brought in from one side. But I think it would be helpful that we maybe begin to particularly focus on Christian marriages, because there is no marriage that is not every Christian marriage is in trouble, but every Christian marriage is under threat. I came across this great quote: we who are married do not have to pretend we are living as Barbie dolls on a wedding cake. We have struggles and dashed expectations too. But if we offer the world a model of a reasonably good marriage, a reasonably good church, it will have radicalizing effects on the world. It's really the first part, that we've got to quit pretending that our marriages are, Barbie doll things of perfection. I have come across maybe 2 or 3 couples in my lifetime, Christian couples, who say that they never argue. And so I've come to some conclusions on that. They're lying.
Yeah.
They're dead. They cannot communicate, or one spouse is just a bully.
Yeah.
I have to say that there is no married couple that never argue. Do you argue?
Yeah.
You know, I argue. I have my wife's permission to say that. No, but I, you know, we do argue, and there are times when you will not feel in love. You know, and there are times that you might look at your spouse or listen to your spouse and you think, why did I ever marry this person? And there's times that it feels it would be easier to walk away. And that's why, you know, we talk about, you know, my Helen and I the other year went to one of these civil ceremonies. You know, it was all done and dusted in 8 minutes, the whole thing, you know. And they'd done their own vows. I remember Helen just turning to me at the end and saying to me, they really didn't promise each other very much. You know, and to me, we can't better the traditional vows, you know, and particularly for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. I think I've done one deathbed wedding where immediately they were living that, and the husband went to heaven 7 days later.
Wow.
And so that was particularly poignant, particularly meaningful for these vows. But on a wedding day, when everything's perfect, these vows seem almost ridiculous, don't they? You know, but that's the whole point. Because when things are perfect, there's no need for a promise. These are vows for when things are not perfect, and we do need a promise. And in that same 7th chapter, isn't that right, of 1 Corinthians, which I would encourage, married or single, because it talks about marriage and singleness. But in that same 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it said, those who marry will face many troubles in this life. And that's why even the best of us and the most godly of us need vows to keep us together. Ruth Bell Graham was asked what it was like being married to Billy Graham. And had they ever considered divorce? And she said, divorce, no. Murder, yes. And so even the best, I know I was tongue-in-cheek, but she was making a point.
Yeah.
That nothing is perfect. There is no Barbie doll.
No. And I think my call would be for people to, in our marriages, to tell the truth. I think because we've made an idol of marriage often, people feel that they can't say how difficult it is. And I remember when me and my wife got married, there was a number of people who got married before us in our kind of group in our church. And it seemed to be this mantra of, well, if the first year, if first year is the hardest in marriage, then I can't wait for the rest of my marriage. This was this kind of couples floating around, feeling like I think they couldn't say. We found our first year of marriage incredibly difficult. We found it really hard. That was when we worked out all those, those boundaries, those peccadillos, those difficulties, it was hard graft. And if it wasn't for those vows that we made, you know what I mean, it could have been very different. But if people had just been honest and said, look, this is going to be really hard. It's going to be difficult. There are going to be moments when you do not feel that kind of the honeymoon phase is fully over. But the whole point is you've made a covenant, and that's why I think it is a covenant. Friends of mine actually have the vows that they made, the vows that you mentioned, on their wall, really nicely decorated. And I thought that's a really nice idea because it's a daily reminder as you come together, that is what I'm committed to. Because I also went to a registry office wedding, and a number of years ago, friends of ours, and I think they had to write these vows, because I can't imagine that any self-respecting registrar would allow these words to be said. But I genuinely, quote, they said to each other, I commit to the feeling of love I have for you. The feeling of love. And I just
There's a wonderful Greek word for that. You know what that is?
Beloved. But to think that that's what was said, you know what I mean? And those moments when you do distinct, what is going on? I am not feeling this at all today. Multiple days. Stuart, if I hadn't made those commitments, and if I had said that and committed to that, and it was done in just with me and my wife and not before the Lord, I would have walked. There are definitely those moments in my sinfulness, in my selfishness, because the thing with marriage is it exposes your sin, and it exposes mostly your selfishness. I want what I want when I want it, and I want it now. And you know what I mean? God brings two people together, and as we're going to look at my book recommendation a little bit later, I think God uses your spouse to expose your selfishness. Yeah. And you have to start to practice Philippians 2 about consider others better than yourselves. Put their needs before your own. All the stuff that Jesus says about love one another, you know, and love your enemies, pray for them, all these things. We so often look at those verses and we apply them directly, externally to other people. But all the things that Jesus says about love, all the things that the New Testament says about caring for others, putting other people's needs before yourselves, is primarily in marriage as well. And obviously we know what love looks like from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. But it's interesting. Is it 12 or 13?
13.
This is 13. I don't want to get that wrong. What's interesting is that passage isn't primarily about marriage. It's actually about within the church community. But I do think that is very helpful. When you talked about how do you know that you are in love with someone, if we go through love is kind, love is patient, doesn't keep any record of wrong, those are a really good. And whereas my friends have got their vows on their wall, we've got 1 Corinthians 13, the love passage on our living room wall. And that's a good reminder that love, I think love partly is a feeling, that feeling of love, but it is so much more than that. You choose to love someone, and you choose to honour and respect them and love them. And so, yeah, it is so much more than a feeling. A feeling is not going to get you through 30 years.
Don Francisco, you ever heard of Don Francisco? Now, he's a gospel singer that us older ones will remember. He actually wrote a song there, Love is not a feeling, it's an act of the will.
Okay.
And it really does tell the truth.
Would you like to sing it for
Not
us?
Really, no. And you wouldn't want that. But you're right. I mean, our first 2 years of marriage, we argued more in that first 2 years. Now, we still argue, but we argued more. And most of it was just about rubbish stuff. But you're discovering, and
yeah, absolutely.
you know. And Helen was always going to go back to her mum's, you know, and she never meant it, you know what I mean. And I was all going to take her, you know, and things like that. But here's the thing, you know, from the very beginning, in all seriousness, you know, the divorce has never been an option in our marriage, and that liberates a marriage. Not to abuse, because I know my wife won't leave me, but because my wife won't leave me. What it empowers the marriage. It really liberates it. And so we know that we will have our arguments, that we will have our pressures and our differences, but we know that the marriage doesn't hinge on it, because divorce is not in our vocabulary. It is not an option for us. I came across an interesting... I read a chapter of Proverbs every day. Done it for nearly 30 years now. And it says this, and I've read this loads of times, and I was reading this just in my daily reading. It wasn't in preparation for today, but obviously I knew today was coming. And you know, and it says this: many a man claims to have unfailing love, but a faithful man who can find? And I then thought about this story, a true story I heard about on a TV, you know, these TV talk shows, and one of the guests was a well-known actor who was particularly known for his romantic roles. And so the guy that was interviewing the actor asked him, what makes a great lover? And to the surprise of the host and the audience, and I think also the millions who were watching, this is what he answered. He says, a great lover is someone who can satisfy one woman all her life long and who can be satisfied by one woman all his life long. A great lover is not someone who goes from woman to woman. Any dog can do that. Many a man claims to have unfailing love. Proverbs 20 verse 6. Many a man claims to have unfailing love, but a faithful man who can find. And marriage is just the beginning for that. A faithful man who can find. Isn't it rare today?
It is, yeah. And I think why I was looking at this verse just a few minutes ago from Hebrews chapter 13, that marriage is to be held in honour among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. I think it's absolutely right that it's easy to be unfaithful, and particularly today, very easy to do that with very little consequences in terms of the proliferation of pornography and just the easy access. If you think even in our lifetimes, we've gone from the kind of the dodgy video store down in the bottom end of town, the kind of the brown paper bag picking up a magazine, all the way through now to the access to millions of images on a phone, you know what I mean, within the click of a button. And so, whereas it talks about adultery and fornication, there we obviously know examples of those who have gone to that point and have been fully unfaithful against their wives. But actually that undefiled there, I think that goes much further than actually you going and joining with someone else and the physical act of adultery. But actually to keep the marriage bed undefiled is a command there to purity in our lives. And I think for you and I, we're thinking, obviously this involves wives as well, but for us it's for the husband's responsibility hugely, I think, to make a covenant with your eyes, not to look lustfully at a woman, like it says in I think, is it Job 31, something like that.
Yes, so, and I read that every morning. Job 31 verse 1, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully. I get on that. I read that verse every single morning. Yeah,
and that is a I think we live in a society where it is we are to be faithful in marriage is to go against the tide of our culture. Not only are people getting married less, obviously divorce rates are very high as well, but just this idea, I think there were some stats out just the other week that said that 50% of people in the UK, that includes men and women, 50% of all adults regularly access pornography. So that is half of the people. And so I don't pretend for a second to think that is, all that 50% who don't involves Christians. Do you know what I mean? I'm sure there are many who are faithful, but this is an issue that is rampant in the church. A friend of mine works for a charity that deals with this and the kind of the shame that comes along with it. What I'm saying is that as the tide goes against us, you have to put your stake in the ground and purposely be countercultural in this, and you have to stand out and make the effort. If you do not spend that time and make that commitment, and it seems really you're making a commitment each day to that, without that then just being pulled along, because there's enough through the billboards and through TV adverts, and do you know what I mean? There's the standard at which the baseline of what can be seen today of exposed flesh, couldn't have even been fathomed 50 years ago, could it? And so, and what are we any stronger today than we were back then? I don't think so. And so it's the same issue, but the access is easier. The way to do it without anyone knowing is so much easier. But I believe that defiles the marriage bed, and it makes a mockery of those commitments that you've made.
Yes, and how many people would see who, before they get married, think that marriage is going to solve all their sexual issues, so and it's not. That is why people who see marriage as either an answer to something or as an escape, they're going to be disappointed. The sexual immorality is not necessarily taken care of just because you get married. And I think that's very important that you've pointed out. One of the things I do say when I have the privilege of marrying a couple, and this touched on something that you said earlier on about the wider family. is that in the actual service, and I do it every time, and I do it intentionally. And I tell the couple I'm going to do it before I say it, but I will remind the couple that the wedding is for a day. Your marriage is for life.
Absolutely.
But I'll also remind the families and the guests that they have been invited to their wedding. They have not been invited to their marriage. Going back to what you said in those verses in Genesis 2, about leaving father and mother and being united to the wife, that then becomes the primary relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just want to finish my part here, because I'm aware of the time, with these beautiful words from Matthew Henry. The woman was made out of the side of Adam, not to be made out of his head to rule over him, not out of his feet to be trampled on by him, but out of his side to be equal to him, under his arm to be protected, and near his heart to be loved.
That's lovely. And there's, as always, so much more that we could talk about here. I was thinking that we have touched on a little bit on divorce, but if that is something that is a particular interest to you, you can have a search for an old Too Hot for Radio program that we did on that. Someone sent in a question about divorce, so that shouldn't be too hard to find. But if there's a specific element of that you would like to ask us, that would be something that we'd be happy to answer in the next session. We also haven't really talked much about the roles within marriage. In terms of, I think both you and I would believe that God calls men to lovingly and sacrificially lead in the household, and women to be the helper that God has set for them. And I know that is very unpopular today. But again, if that's something you'd like us to talk about a little bit more, we could look into that. But marriage is a good thing, isn't it? And I think there's so much more we could talk about. You mentioned friendship and fun, and marriage is a... I guess what I would want to say is that marriage is not just a good idea, it's a God idea. God has defined what marriage is, and it's a shame that in today's culture we actually have to define marriage, that it is one man and one woman for life. It's crazy that we are living in a day when that has been, to think we'll look back on it and it's within our generation that's been redefined, something that is from the foundation of the world has been set by God. But it's a good idea on its own, even for people who aren't Christians. When I look at my non-Christian friends who are cohabitating, having kids, it is better for them if they get married. It is better for society. It's better for their children. It is for the good of all of marriage. But beyond that, though, it is ultimately God's idea. And God defines what marriage is, and God has decided that this is the best way, I think, to establish society. And ultimately, God is so involved in marriage that he uses that illustration for him and his people, and that God would actually marry them. So there's so much there that we could talk about. But we will move on now to our book recommendation. I think it's my turn this month. Now, I thought, considering the topic that we've been looking at, I would bring a book recommendation about marriage. And so I couldn't just do one. I am going to totally cheat today. I am, because I haven't brought my Bible, I'll just have two books instead. So, two book recommendations. The first is this. We'll see if we can put up an image as well. This is God, Marriage and Family, Rebuilding the Biblical Foundation. This is by Andreas Kostenberger with David Jones. And I heard about this book about 12, 13 years ago. And basically, this is not the how to have a good marriage, how to have a healthy marriage. This is simply the Bible's take on all of it from the start. So it starts with marriage in terms of the Old Testament, then marriage in terms of the New Testament. It looks at singleness, it looks at homosexuality. It's really, in a sense, a kind of encyclopedia of every verse to do with marriage and the family, and basically making sure that we have a biblical foundation for those things. And so I would, it's a large book, but it's one of those books that you can dip into and not have to read from start to finish. But I found this very helpful, just as getting back to the foundations of what the Bible says. And again, it touches on everything that you can imagine. Yeah, so teaching on divorce, teaching on remarriage, talking about faithful husbands and qualifications for eldership, talking about homosexuality that I've mentioned. And basically goes through every book of the Bible and looks for what the Bible says about marriage. So I would recommend that as a kind of a deep read I think that's useful for pastors, for leaders, for preachers, to kind of just get that solid foundation. My second recommendation is more of the how to have a healthy marriage. And this is my recommendation. It's called Sacred Marriage. It's by Gary Thomas. And the story with this is I was a season a long time ago when I just was having a bit of a hard season in marriage and wanted to think a little bit more about it and get some resources. And so I saw this, and ultimately I loved the front cover. You see the pairs on there? I just thought, oh, that's nice. And so I probably bought it for the wrong reason, which was I bought the book for its cover. And I have to say the tagline has always stuck with me. What if God designed marriage to make us holy more than to make us happy?
Wow.
And that is really the sum up of the whole book. It's come into a little controversy in recent years because some people have written some blogs where they've said, no, God has designed marriage to make us happy. And the thing is, if you've read the book, he's not saying that's that that's not a reality. Let me read you a quote just to show that. He says, one of the reasons I'm determined to keep my marriage together is not because doing so will make me happier, although I believe it will. Not because I want my kids to have a secure home, although I do desire that. Not because it would tear me up to see my wife have to start over, although it would. The first reason I keep my marriage together is because of my Christian commitment. It is my life. My life is based on proclaiming God's message to the world. I don't want to do anything that would challenge that message. And how can I proclaim reconciliation when I seek dissolution? I really would strongly recommend this book. Read the blogs and see if you think they're on something. But I think they've unfairly characterised it as but ultimately, there's this great illustration that he talks about, and he says, we have this idea of going away on spiritual retreats, and that's going to make us more, have a family away up in the hills, and that'll get me reconnected with God. And he said, if you want to be more holy, to spend time with your wife and your family. And that in itself, enough of the, putting the kids to bed and they're bickering and your wife's tired and all those things, those day-to-day things that God uses in marriage and in family, God uses to shape us to be holy, to stop us being selfish. And I just love the way he just talks about it. This idea of going off on a weekend is all great for me, but that isn't actually going to make you more like Jesus. So those are two books that I would recommend to you. That is our book recommends. I think you've got a song or hymn recommend.
I have got a song, and it's a children's song, Tom. And I'm glad you're sitting down because you'll know.
Wicked, brill. Now's the time.
In a previous Too Hot for Radio podcast, those who listened or watched will have known that I, over the years, have kind of fallen out of love with children's choruses of these days because they're just stupid. Namely, it's great, brill, wicked, skill to have a friend like Jesus. And so when a great children's song comes...
you jump on it.
Yes, and I only heard this 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
The church that I was at, one of the great things about this church is that they do teach the children. It used to be called Sunday school for a reason, and we need to get back to that when it comes to children's work. I went to Sunday school, and it was Sunday school. We were taught the scriptures. Whatever happened to scripture memorization? Or do you ever do sword drill when you were younger?
Yes.
And it was fun, but it really got you into the Bible. And sadly, in too many places, when it comes to Sunday school or the children going out during the service, it's about child minding, not about teaching our children. And we need to get back to that. And so during the after the children's story, this particular Sunday morning, this was the song that they sang, and it's by Dan Adams, but it's from a ministry called Awesome Cutlery.
Oh yes, yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah.
Right, and so you might know it, but I just thought the reason why I love this song is because it's teaching children, but it takes them through the scriptures. This one's called "Is God's People in God's Place." I'll just quickly read the lyrics. Excellent, I'm sure you'll put them up. Creation, Adam and Eve and the fall, Noah, the flood and the Tower of Babel. God had a plan. He told Abraham and promised his family would be God's people in God's place under his rule. They will know his blessing, his blessing. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, 12 sons. A nation of slaves, an Egyptian hot sun. God had a plan through Moses, his man. He rescued them so they could be God's people in God's place under his rule. Joshua conquered the land and moved in. Judges showed that they needed a king. God had a plan through David, his man. He ruled them and made them to be God's people in God's place under his rule. Solomon brought wisdom and blessing, but then division, rebellion, so God punished them, sent them away. His prophets proclaimed that one day a remnant would be God's people in God's place under his rule. They will know his blessing. Jesus, everything finally revealed. The church share the good news with the world. God made his plan before time began. When Jesus returns, we will be God's people in God's place under his rule. They'll know his blessing. And I just thought that is great. It's teaching the scriptures.
Story of the Bible.
I really commend it to you. So really look up Awesome Cutlery, but this particular song is God's people in God's place.
Excellent. You have surprised me today, Stuart.
I know you didn't know that was coming.
No, not at all. All a bit unscripted. But as always, thank you so much for being with us. I feel like as I'm thinking over what we've said, it's just so much, isn't there? And so we really would implore you, if you would like to know more, there's a specific element that you think that we've not addressed, specific parts that you'd like us to talk about again, if that is going to help you, we totally could. We could talk for another hour, I'm sure. So do let us know. Send us an email to info@gmba.net, and you also send your questions through to that email, which we're going to do not next month, but the month after. Our plan is next month to do a session on parenting that will kind of follow on from what we've been talking about here on marriage. So thanks so much for joining me. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you. And just for those who are listening, will have noticed then, for who'd like to pick up mistakes, Tom's deliberate mistake, that'll be November, God willing, for those questions, and not October.
Indeed.
So, but thank you. You can write in and say that you picked Tom up in that.
At least I've got someone here to sort me out. That's all good. Thanks so much for being with us, and we will be back next month, the first Friday.